Hello and welcome to today's Schiller Institute conference, Syria Sanctions Must Be Lifted. The death toll in the Syrian Turkey earthquake is now more than 46,000, but yet even now the United States and the Anglosphere, more broadly, continues to weaponize the earthquake, even to the point of using it as the occasion to, if possible, restart armed conflict in the area. The United States has so far not lifted its notorious Caesar sanctions, thus prohibiting a full international effort to respond to the catastrophe. In a world now careening to thermonuclear war, the Anglosphere is pursuing a kind of four horsemen diplomacy. Instead of seizing the occasion of the earthquake for potential good, the process of demonization of the Syrian regime continues to the exclusion of the suffering and death of tens of thousands and the displacement of millions. This is Malthusianism in its most brutal form, a kind of four horsemen of the apocalypse diplomacy. War is a form of diplomacy these days. We are all very familiar with that. Famine is used as a weapon against disobedient nations. Pestilence? What about the pestilence of usury, of criminal indebtedness? The most in debt most loudly assert the primacy of their dead and dying monetary system. And then, of course, the fourth horseman, death, the pale horse, which is sort of the metaphor for U.S. policy as a whole, increasingly around the world. We had an exchange on February 6th between a journalist and the spokesman for the government, Ned Price, where a journalist said, "Why not reach out to the Syrian government? They are in power. They're the ones that run these rescue operations. It would be a great gesture. Another gesture would be to sort of lift the sanctions that have basically suffocated Syria." And the answer that Ned Price gave was, "I'm going to resist the temptation to go into your advocacy rather than questioning, but I will make the point that it would be quite ironic, if not even counterproductive, for us to reach out to a government responsible for much of the suffering that they have endured." So these regimes have lost credibility, but more importantly, they've also lost humanity. We are not going to stand for that, and today's assembly is called for the purpose of informing the largest number of people what the actual situation is and what they can do about it. So speaking first today is the founder and chairman of the Schiller Institute, Helga Sepp-LaRouche. Helga?
Well, I greet you. Obviously, we are in a horrendous situation. What we are facing is the escalation of the war danger, which could, according to the Chinese foreign minister, spiral out of control between NATO and Russia. We are experiencing traumatic developments. Putin, in his annual speech, the sort of State of the Union address, basically suspended the participation of Russia in the START treaty, and that is the final element of the arms negotiation, arms control body, which is now finished. So then we have today a dramatic meeting of the UN Security Council called by Russia, discussing the revelations by Seymour Hersh, who presented a whole bunch of evidence that it was the United States which, in all likelihood, committed the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline. So, I only want to touch upon these things to say that all of these developments, however, should not prevent us from putting the spotlight on the unprecedented crisis in Syria, which, is in danger of falling completely between the cracks. What must be done, and this is an appeal to the world community, there must be an immediate humanitarian aid, but that requires that the sanctions which prevent any aid to arrive in Syria in time or in any noteworthy dimension must be immediately lifted, and these sanctions are illegal anyway. So people know there happened a rather severe earthquake on February 6th This was on a 7.8 Richter scale level, and two major earthquakes followed, and even a couple of hours ago, there was still another one. So the death toll, while difficult to know exactly, it's around 50,000 people already in both Turkey and Syria. And while there was international aid to Turkey, the situation in Syria is, due to the sanctions, a total catastrophe. Cardinal Senari, the papal nuncio, who already had called several years ago that these sanctions must be urgently lifted, because they have led to a situation where, on top of war, on top of a country being torn apart in large part because of Western backing of the rebels, of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, more than 90% of the people are already living in severe poverty, and that was before the earthquake. Now, Cardinal Senari went to Aleppo, and he reported from there that the temperature is extremely cold. There's no shelter. Many people who left their homes in terror found shelter in religious facilities. They are afraid to go back in their homes because after years of war, all of these homes are severely, weakened by earlier tremors and shooting. And what Cardinal Senari reports is that many people are so completely desperate, and they're saying, why does this happen to us? We have been living under bombs. We had to endure the rebels. Now these earthquakes. Bombs of poverty are much worse. This is what Senari called the, effects of the sanctions. So what the Syrian people right now are experiencing is a tragedy within a tragedy. So according to local witnesses, and we will hear some of them later in this program, the sanctions are the reason why the passage of aid is being blocked at the border. So, there is no way how we can allow to have the fate of the Syrian population not in the limelight of the international awareness after 12 years of war, COVID, sanctions, the collapse of the currency, and the latest catastrophe is just more than what people can bear. But we also want to say that, but when Cardinal Senari says that the whole country is engulfed in a sea of pain, and despite the fact that there is some aid coming from Russia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, it is also true what Xavier Bisitz from the Aids to the Church in Need, the ACN, says is there is little, if any, international aid, and there is a complete lack of international support. Now, the main reason for this is the Caesars Act. This is based on a complete fraud. This was uncovered several years ago already by Max Blumenthal from the gray zone. This was Caesar was the name of this mysterious person who supposedly brought photos from the crimes of the Syrian government against civilians. But this was just a pretext for a regime change operation against the Syrian government, because on these pictures, it was mostly Syrian soldiers who had been killed by terrorists. So this is a fraud, and this fraud must end momentarily. And we call upon you, the people who are watching, that you have to demand that the American Congress immediately lifts these sanctions, because any more day or hour is contributing to the killing of the Syrian people. Now, the real aim of this was spelled out by James Jeffrey, the special envoy to Syria during the Trump administration, who basically said that anybody who wants to reconstruct Syria cannot do that without paying attention to the Caesar sanctions. That basically means never. The unilateral sanctions, in any case, make the question of human rights completely meaningless. It's part of asymmetric warfare. It's a collective punishment of the civilian population. The aim is to make their suffering so unbearable that they will contribute and become an instrument of regime change. So it's completely illegal. It makes the weakest, the old people, the sick people, the children, the women bear the cost of this whole operation. And it is illegal. I think unilateral sanctions should be banned. They violate international law. Now, the only kinds of sanctions which could possibly be legal are those which are adopted by the UN Security Council, and that only if it does not violate the basic right of the population in the affected country. So the sanctions have to go, but then we immediately have to put also on the table the economic reconstruction of Syria. Now, the Schiller Institute already in 2014 presented a project which we called at the time the Phoenix Project, which is a vast program, basically to completely reconstruct the Syrian economy, which now must start with a vast, gigantic housing construction program for the return of the many millions of refugees. I think altogether something like 10 million refugees, if you count the refugees who have gone abroad to neighbor countries, to European countries, also inside Syria. Schools must be reconstructed, hospitals, but also agriculture must be rebuilt, pharmaceutical industry, petrochemical, aerospace, electronics, machine tool. President Assad had the vision in 2009 already of what he called the strategy of the 5 Cs, which was the idea to integrate through a waterway system the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Caspian Ocean, and the Black Sea. And that must become the backbone of the integration of Syria into the new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, which now, given the fact that even Saudi Arabia and Turkey have basically applied to be members in the BRICS countries, and that President Xi Jinping has offered the integration of the Mediterranean into the Belt and Road Initiative, that must be put on the agenda immediately. But that does not take away the absolute moral requirement of Europe, of the United States to participate in the reconstruction of Syria. So I want to leave it at that, and we should absolutely mobilize the world population to this effect.
Thank you, Helga. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. You've just heard Helga Sepp-LaBrouche, founder and leader of the Schiller Institute. Our next speaker is Vanessa Beeley, who's a British activist and journalist who has been covering Syria on site. I believe she's there now. Vanessa, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me. I think what I want to try and say tonight is that, of course, the sanctions should be lifted, and effectively the Caesar law is one of the most criminal and vindictive sanctions package that has ever been used or weaponized against a sovereign nation. You mentioned that effectively it prevents any nation coming to the aid of Syria for rebuilding and reconstitution of the country into a workable territory again. But I don't feel personally, and I live in Syria, I've been living here, this is my 4th year, I've been working here for 7 years. For me, the sanctions go hand in hand with the illegal occupation of this country on 3 sectors of its borders. The only friendly border is with Lebanon, and we know that Lebanon also itself is under attack by the Anglosphere to further weaken it so that it's unable or it's not as capable of coming to the full aid of Syria during this attempt to devastate and destroy Syria. The occupation of Syrian territories in the northeast, you have, of course, the United States. alongside its Kurdish Contra proxies. Along the northern border, you have Turkey via its own proxies, which we know, of course, to have been the relabeled Free Syrian Army and Al-Qaeda elements that are occupying a region of northern Syria at the northwest, which is occupied by Al-Qaeda, dominated by Al-Qaeda, which we know to be a US asset. Ambassador Jeffries termed it such during Trump's administration. Jake Sullivan wrote an email to Hillary Clinton in 2012 stating that Al-Qaeda was on the side of the United States during this regime change war. And in the south, of course, we have the historic and illegal annexation of the Golan territories by the Zionist entity. In my view, the occupation of these territories, the occupation of Palestine, is also a priority. The sanctions, in a sense, for me, are symptoms of the cause, and the cause is the occupation, the illegal occupation of Syrian territory and Palestinian territory. Why do I say this? Because, in all honesty, when I speak to Syrians, the sanctions they can deal with, sanctions have been imposed upon them for decades, including, of course, for their so-called harboring of the PKK labeled terrorists at that point, now, of course, being weaponized by the United States against Syria. You have a situation now where the border crossings into Syria are completely under the control of hostile states, apart from one opening, which is Al-Bukamal in the northeast, which is regularly bombed by the Zionist entity, destroying humanitarian convoys even before the earthquake. And how has the Zionist entity responded to the humanitarian tragedy in Syria? It bombed Syria. In the early hours of the morning of February the 19th, Israeli Zionist warplanes launched missiles at a number of sites in Syria. Imagine this, after an earthquake on the 6th of February, and then multiple aftershocks that have continued the devastation of this country and the trauma and the stress for the population, now rendered homeless again for the second or third time since 2011. Israel, while promising to send aid, is in reality bombing the population here. In Kafr Souze, which is about 15 minutes away from where I live, 5 civilians were killed. An apartment block was irreparably damaged. Now, among those civilians was a cardiologist, a pharmacist, and an engineer. The Iranian Cultural Center is about 3 blocks away from where they targeted. They also targeted Damascus Citadel, an archaeological institute where they have some of the most up-to-date equipment for investigating archaeological sites. And they destroyed a number of historic documents appertaining to the Citadel and also to Damascus. So this is eugenics. This is the destruction and the erasure of cultural identity and heritage by the Zionist entity. And of course, this has been ongoing since 2011. Now, at the same time, somebody alluded quite correctly to the fact that the West is exploiting this tragedy to effectively kickstart the war again against Syria. Why can I say that with some confidence? Because you mentioned in the Northwest that aid is being prevented coming into Syria. Well, no, that's not true. Aid, or rather equipment, is entering the Northwest through the Bab al-Hawa crossing, which is totally controlled by Al-Qaeda. In fact, historically, it has been a revenue provider for Al-Qaeda. Any humanitarian aid entering that border crossing is requisitioned by Al-Qaeda and then sold at extortionate rates to the Syrian population under their occupation. None of this humanitarian aid generally will get to the Syrian people in the areas that they control, that Al-Qaeda control. However, there is now millions of funding being raised for who? for the CIA MI6 White Helmet organization, which we know to be nothing more than an auxiliary of Al-Qaeda and the various splinter armed groups. Literally 85 million from US aid, hundreds of millions pledged by their PR complex in the West. Where is this money going? This money is not coming in for, as they claim, heavy machinery. Leading up to 2022, US aid had already provided $25.2 million in funding for heavy machinery and equipment for the White Helmets. So this funding that is now being raised by the West is effectively to rearm and reinforce the armed groups in the Northwest, to restart the military campaign against now an even more fragile Syrian state. We saw literally 2 days after the first earthquake on the 6th of February, the breakout from Raju prison in the north of Afrin, which is under the control of the Turkish intelligence agencies, of ISIS terrorists that we also know to be for certain a proxy of the United States and its allies in the globalist cartel. And at least 2 attacks have been carried out against civilians in the east of Homs since the earthquake. In both occasions, dozens of civilians were kidnapped. And the last attack, we know that 53 civilians, not military soldiers or armed forces, civilians were murdered while they were truffle hunting to the east of Homs. We know that the United States is effectively now transferring ISIS, as it has been doing, of course, since it's had control of the Northeast. It effectively ferries ISIS backward and forwards across the Iraqi border. Now it's sending them to Ukraine. But we see now that the entire military effort or proxy military effort is being re-energized and resurrected by the West, because they see an opportunity to now militarily strike again at Syria. And the attack by the Zionist entity is a part of this campaign. It can't be separated. There are also NGOs in the Northwest, like the Molham team, which is raising money for the armed groups, we have to assume. And we know now in the last 2 days that Israel has opened a bank account especially to be funding this NGO in the Northwest. So the tentacles of the Zionist entity and the Western, the Anglosphere cabal are now reaching out to try and militarily destroy Syria. The West basically wants Syrians dead, and sanctions have not worked. Syrians are resilient, they're resourceful, and despite the fact that 90% of the population is below the poverty level, they have survived. Now they have, whether it's man-made or it's natural, they have a terrible humanitarian tragedy. 5 million estimated homeless in Syria, Syria real, and even in the Northwest, which, as I said, is under the control of the Western-backed terrorist groups. It is a humanitarian tragedy, but the West is not helping. Who is coming to the aid of Syrians? Russia, Iran, Algeria, Armenia, Venezuela, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Hashd al-Shabi from Iraq. The allies, the non-aligned bloc, effectively has defied the Caesar sanctions and has not been punished for it so far. Of course, we don't know what will happen in the future. But I think what it has done is to draw the battle lines. It's drawn the lines where we can see very clearly the countries that are prepared to challenge US, Zionist, and UK, EU hegemony in the region. And what Syria needs now is, yes, for the sanctions to be lifted, but more than anything, it needs American US occupation ended. Not forgetting, of course, that they also occupy the southeast in their Al-Tanef military base, which also controls the Rukban refugee camp, has established a 55-kilometer no entry zone around it, where it's training and arming armed groups, including ISIS. So end the occupation, please.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And if you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute, Syrian Sanctions Must Be Lifted. You've just heard Vanessa Beeley, a British activist, journalist, reporting directly from Syria. Our next speaker is Colonel Richard Black, former head of the United States Army Criminal Law Division at the Pentagon, former Virginia State Senator. Colonel Black, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dennis. I want to just recap for our listeners a little bit about the origins of the Syrian war. This was not a domestic uprising in any respect. The United States planned and instigated the war from the outset. In 2007, which was 4 years before the war actually began, WikiLeaks intercepted a 2007 cable where the U.S. Embassy in Damascus was describing in detail how we could overthrow the government. And one of the key things that they proposed was that we foster religious hatred between the Shia and Sunni Muslims, and that would have a very destabilizing effect on the country. And indeed, that turned out to be the case. In 2011, 3 months before the war began in Syria, the United States, UK, and France launched an unprovoked attack against Libya. We captured their huge arsenal of weapons. We sent those weapons to Turkey, which then funneled them across the border to the Islamic terrorists who were destabilizing the nation. By 2012, just shortly after the beginning of the war, within a year, the CIA was already channeling weapons to all Syrian terrorists. There were mountains of weapons being sent from warehouses that were built secretly by the Central Intelligence Agency across the border inside of Turkey. President Obama authorized this under covert program Timber Sycamore. The terrorists who conducted the uprising against the legitimate government of Syria employed a doctrine of horror. The doctrine of horror was the notion that if you could create such paralyzing fear among the people, they would simply give up and they would not resist. Our biggest proxies throughout this war have been Al-Qaeda in Syria, which has gone through a number of names, al-Nusra, Tahrir al-Sham, and sort of this blur of names designed to confuse the public. But they have been our principal ally during the war. Al-Qaeda in Syria. Al-Qaeda, the same group that flew the jets into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon on 9/11, killing 3,000 Americans here in this country. These were the groups that we now allied ourselves with just 10 years after 9/11. The doctrine of horror was so grisly and so barbaric that it was not possible for the CIA to directly supply weapons to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For that reason, we funneled tanks, artillery, missiles, all sorts of heavy advanced weapons in massive quantities. We transferred them, we sold them to Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar for the express purpose of arming Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There was no crime that was too hideous for us to support. Our ultimate goal throughout this was to create a neo-colonial empire with the United States at its head, in which we could control all of the oil and gas resources of the Middle East. And we set about that in part through invading Iraq, which was an unprovoked war, has resulted in the loss of 1 or 2 million people. Syria has been the major stumbling block for NATO and the Western powers and what they're trying to do. Now, throughout this war in Syria, the media have been complicit in the war crimes that have dominated the war, and they have portrayed the terrorists as nice fellows who simply want a little more democracy. The fact is that all of these groups have come forward and they have said very publicly that their desire was to impose a radical Islamic state, which would be governed by 8th century Sharia law. So the entire media narrative has been completely false. The doctrine of horror employed as one of its key weapons mass rape. Now, we hear a lot of allegations about rape, that this happens, that happens, and there are rapes that occur as incidents of war. The difference is that in Syria, mass rape was employed as a fundamental element of the terrorist doctrine. It was the idea that you could plant your seeds within all of the women of the nation, and that would advance your cause. And you could also create this sense of paralyzing fear. Many Syrian women committed suicide rather than be gang raped by jihadists when they knew that the terrorists were about to come through. The incidence of rape has been so horrific in Syria that the government, the legislature, and the president found it necessary to enact new laws modifying the traditional Islamic approach on paternity so that the rapist would not have paternal rights over the children of the women that they impregnated through rape. There was a case in which one of the jihadist war leaders used to take a 13-year-old slave that he held, a girl. He would strip her naked and he would tie her to the windshield of his Humvee, his American Humvee, that he drove into battle. And he did this knowing that the Syrian Arab army, which is very disciplined, very fine troops, that they would not shoot at a poor, sobbing girl who was tied to his windshield. Now, the Syrian people never, at any stage during this 11-year war, have come behind any of the leaders that the United States has proposed. Not a single one has achieved widespread popularity with the people of Syria. The people of Syria back Bashar al-Assad, their president. They have elected him, they have re-elected him, and they want their freedom. They want their constitution. Now, Syria has the only constitution among all of the Arab countries that provides guarantees of religious freedom. I've read the Constitution. It guarantees religious freedom in 3 places. It guarantees women's rights. It is the most modern of all of the constitutions, and yet of all things, it is criticized. The United States has Saudi Arabia do the major criticism of the Syrian constitution, and here is Saudi Arabia, which has no constitution. It operates under a vicious Sharia law, and they're criticizing Syria for not having a sufficiently liberal constitution. Quite absurd. Well, what happened? The Syrian people, through enormous force of will, here's a small country of 23 million people who confronted 2/3 of the world's military and industrial might, determined to crush them, hoping to tear apart pieces of their flesh and to accumulate whatever wealth they could. And yet Syria fought off all of these countries, all of the NATO countries, all of the Western countries. So what happened is in 2016, by the grace of God, the Syrian army began to drive back. They defeated ISIS. They pushed them out of Palmyra first. Later, they pushed them out of Aleppo in a great battle that was reminiscent of the tremendous World War II battle at Stalingrad, where Hitler's forces finally lost the battle at Stalingrad, and that was the beginning of the end. The loss of Aleppo which had been fought over for 4 years, was the beginning of the end for the Syrian terrorists. And at that point, John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, was absolutely furious. He saw ISIS and Al-Qaeda being pushed back, seeing them lose the initiative. And at that point, he announced that the United States would now implement Plan B. Plan B was designed where the United States would invade Syria in the northern part. Northern Syria is the breadbasket of the entire country. That's where the wheat is grown, and it also is the primary source of oil for heating and for transportation. John Kerry's Plan B was designed to capture that, which we did. We landed American troops, we occupied, we fought against the Syrian army in many respects. We provided air support to ISIS forces in the battle at Deir ez-Zor and allowed ISIS to cut apart the defenders, heroic defenders at Deir ez-Zor in a 2-hour airstrike by American troops, followed immediately by an enormous attack by ISIS troops who were preparing and had coordinated with the United States in that battle. We now, by virtue of the United States occupying all of northern Syria, knocking out the opposition from Deir ez-Zor, even though it was never captured by ISIS, but we diminished its strength, and we occupied all of this. What did we do? We had two objectives in seizing the north. The first was to impose widespread famine on the entire country, to create starvation, to create childhood malnutrition. The other objective was to freeze to death the Syrian people, particularly the elderly people who were more vulnerable to being exposed, with all of the buildings having been blown down by American weapons throughout this 11-year war. Plan B has been effective, but Plan B needed another facet, and that was the Caesar sanctions. The United States imposed a military naval blockade, and using that blockade, we have imposed these absolutely inhuman sanctions that were designed to prevent Syria from rebuilding. There was a specific provision of the Caesar sanctions that punishes anyone who helps in the rebuilding effort. We wanted the people to remain living in rubble, exposed to the cold, freezing, starving. This was the objective of the Caesar sanctions. The last lifeline that we could figure out to destroy was that there were some Syrian businesses and business interests that did their banking in Lebanon. We orchestrated, we don't know all of the details of it, but shortly after Mike Pompeo declared that we were going to tighten these sanctions like they'd never been tightened, shortly afterwards there was a mysterious explosion of a ship carrying ammonium nitrate fertilizer, which is explosive. It exploded and devastated Beirut Harbor, killing many people, wounding a mass of thousands of people. And in the process, we managed to collapse Lebanon's banking system and destroy all of the wealth of the businesses from Syria. There is no crime that is too hideous for the United States to participate in. And what we are seeing occurring now is a continuation of the horror that has been going on. I'm going to give just one example in closing. Now, this has been going on, and there are 1,000 like this, but I will not show this photo, but I will describe it. It is too grisly to show. This was the massacre at Al-Zora. In Al-Zora, the group called Tahrir al-Sham seized a small Alawite village. They went through, and what this photo shows, there was very little resistance in the village. It had a few militiamen, and they were faced by this large force of Al-Qaeda cutout people. This picture shows a small room, which was apparently used by mothers to teach their children their school lessons. And on the floor are 3 bodies, as near as I can tell. There may be 4 women, young ladies, very, very light-skinned, European in appearance. These are Alawite women. They're known as the Friends of the Christians. And the woman in the foreground, lying dead, she has light reddish hair, pale-skinned, looks very European. There is one of the jihadists. This is an American-supplied armed jihadist standing with his boot on her still warm and bleeding body. And in the background, there is a horrific amount of blood spatter. This isn't just like someone throwing a glass of blood. This is spray from bullets slamming into the bodies of these young mothers. And there's another woman laying on her side, her face streaming with blood. And then there's a third whose face doesn't show. And there are 2 jihadists proudly parading, and the one has his boot stamped heavily on the back of the young red-headed woman, and he's taking a selfie of himself. They killed reportedly some 43 of the women and children in Al-Zora that day. They kidnapped another 70 and sold them into sex slavery. I received oral reports that they took the children in the village, that they tied them to the fence in the village, that they made them watch as they tortured and executed many of their parents. And afterwards, they went to the children who were tied to the fence, sobbing, pleading, begging for mercy. They doused them with gasoline, they lit fire to them, and they burned them to death. This is the character of the people that we have supported. The United States and the West have supported these people throughout 11 years of war with our singular determination that we will topple the freest, most liberal nation in the Arab world, Saudi Arabia or Syria, and that we will turn it over to people like this who take selfies standing on the backs of innocent women. It is disgraceful. And now we're following up by taunting the people of Syria who are under this terrible earthquake devastation, and we're taunting them about how they really should have gone the other way. They should have been on our side, and now they're getting what they deserve, is essentially what the State Department is saying. It is a disgrace. It is a horror. If the American people understood what is happening, this government would fall. This government could not exist in the United States if the American people were not shielded by this complicit media in the horrors that we have imposed on the Syrian people. Thank you.
And thank you, Colonel Black. If you've just joined us, welcome to today's conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute. Syrian sanctions must be lifted. You've just heard Colonel Richard Black, former head of the United States Army Criminal Law Division